It's the morning rush hour in London. A man has been murdered in a park.
Nobody heard anything, nobody saw anything, no one was running away.
The crime scene holds the secrets to the story.
It's crucial to locate this knife. You may well be able to find the offender's DNA.
But when the killer strikes again,
somebody is carrying out random stabbings. The community is full of fear and worry.
The pressure mounts.
If it's a stranger attack, there are more likely to be psychiatric issues.
We didn't know who this killer was, and we were fearful they will go on to cause further harm and injury to the people of London.
And it's down to the forensics to find the evidence to catch the killer. It's rush hour in London. A member of the public has discovered a male collapsed in the middle of a park. He has been stabbed in the stomach.
About 8:07, a female commuter called the police emergency services via 999. By the time local uniformed police officers and the London Ambulance Service arrived, he was already dead. I responded to the crime, arrived at the scene. First of all, you're going to think securement of the crime scene. Police officers standing on cordons in order that we can conduct a physical and forensic recovery for evidence to understand what's happened.
Kendall Gardens is just 500 metres from Morden Underground Station and is a popular cut-through for commuters. Officers search for eyewitnesses whilst the crime scene is sealed off.
When a call comes into the police of a fatal stabbing in a park area in rush hour in London, indications are that this is going to be a big job.
Sarah Thurkell has spent 30 years in crime scene investigation and is one of the UK's most renowned forensic trainers.
The victim's body would be examined within the crime scene before it's removed to the post-mortem and any potential trace evidence taken from it. The ideal situation would be to get a pathologist to the scene to examine the body in situ and potentially remove clothing, take swabs from any injuries or marks. In a parkland area, this would cause a lot of issues because it's obviously an open area. You've got the problems of the weather conditions, lighting conditions, members of the public that are able to view where the body is, the press that's going to turn up. So there would be a tent brought to the scene and placed over the deceased, which then allows us to control that area a little bit better and to be able to fully exploit all forensic opportunities on the deceased.
He had a single stab wound through his abdominal wall. It had penetrated his bladder. It is called catastrophic blood loss and had stopped his heart. And he would die within a very short space, probably 1 minute from when he was stabbed. He had his mobile telephone with him, his house keys and some identification. It helped us identify the body as Daniel Young.
Officers make urgent inquiries to contact Daniel's family.
If you get to know the victim, you may well find your way to the attacker.
Detective Chief Inspector Cliff Lyons searches for any obvious CCTV cameras that may have captured what happened and caught sight of the killer.
Neither entrance to the park or exit to the park is covered by a CCTV camera. There was no eyewitnesses. There was no volume, there was no noise, nobody heard anything, nobody saw anything, no one was running away. It might explain somehow how eyewitnesses didn't see the offence, because although it's a large park, there's certain curves and areas which sort of gives you a limited range of vision. You then come to what I would call in investigation terms a hypothesis of what may have happened. He had his mobile telephone with him, which was actually visible on the ground and it hadn't been taken. It sort of negated a motive of robbery as a first blush instinct at that stage. There wasn't any obvious signs of defence injury. He hadn't had any time to thwart his attacker. So it would indicate that he was taken by surprise, either by someone he knew, who got that close, or someone who just took him by surprise. You have a young man lying here at that time in the morning, a brazen killing. It could have been a drug deal that had gone wrong. It could have been a jealous lover, a disgruntled ex-employee. It could be someone who had a grudge against Daniel. It could have been some sort of statement murder. But the point is, we just didn't know. We had no clue at that stage. Everything was on the table.
In order to be able to stab somebody, the offender has to be quite close to the victim. So not only would there be potential for blood transfer, but also for fibre transfer between the offender's clothing and the victim's clothing. So it's really important for the victim's clothing to be preserved as much as possible for any trace evidence that might be on them. The park area would hold a huge amount of potential forensic evidence that may or may not be linked to the victim and or the suspects. A decision would be made to shut the parkland area and a fingertip search to be conducted. Looking at the stab wounds on the victim with the pathologist, is it possible to ascertain the size of the knife? That therefore then would narrow down the search for a potential knife.
In order to take on a crime scene of this size, it's going to take days, sometimes weeks, to search. You can see a huge amount of undergrowth. I was able to secure the services of 2 specialist search teams, which are called pulsar teams. So we would radiate from where he fell. It was important for us to secure evidence because we had a man on the loose who clearly killed one person. The danger was it could go on to offend and hurt more individuals.
Having taken all the samples in situ, Daniel's body is transported to the mortuary for a full post-mortem examination. Officers have managed to track down Daniel Young's family, who live 200 miles away in Devon.
I got home, I walked in and I knew something wasn't right. My oldest brother, Chris, and my mum were sat on the sofa, and I can still see Chris saying it now. Dan's not with us anymore. Everyone was in a state of shock. No one actually knew what had happened. The only scenario we could come up with was that he was going to work and he had sort of smart clothes on and had his bag with his laptop. That it was a mugging or something like that, but then that was quickly quashed when the police said all of his belongings are still on him.
It's a feature of many murder investigations, but you have to keep an open mind that they would normally know the identity of their attacker. And because of that, we will intrusively look at the life of the victim.
Originally from Devon, Daniel had moved to London and had started a new job as a university lecturer only the day before he was killed. His house is less than 100 metres from where he was murdered.
When the police started to look into Dan and Dan's life, they could easily tell that Dan wasn't someone that was in a dodgy crowd or anything like that.
What we came across was a young man. He was successful in his career. He got himself a good degree in hospitality, and he got himself a really good job working for Coventry University on their London campus as a lecturer. This was only his second day at work.
We were kind of racking our brains thinking, oh, it could be people we've worked with, we've had disagreements with. When we were kind of going through each person, we couldn't think of anything significant enough that would warrant this sort of action. For it to happen so close to his house, we were just like, it can't be someone who he knows, it's got to be something random.
The specialist search teams continue to comb the vast crime scene for any evidence that will help them identify the killer. Just as Cliff's team have the crime scene under control, news of a disturbing development comes through from the major incident room.
I was alerted that there'd been a previous stabbing within an hour prior to Daniel's death, which was non-fatal, but was a mile away and was just after 7 o'clock in the morning. Both incidents on their own are highly unusual for that time of day, but incredibly unusual to be so closely linked in time of geographical distance and the time.
When it becomes apparent that there's been a second attack, this then would escalate the police response, not only to preserve members of the public, but also to preserve a potential crime scene. There's a killer on the loose who may well strike again.
"30-year-old university lecturer Daniel Young has been murdered. He has been stabbed once in the stomach whilst walking through the park during the rush hour commute. Detectives have failed to find any eyewitnesses, and news comes in of another stabbing, less than a mile away. Senior investigating officer Cliff Lyons learns the victim is 23-year-old Polish builder, Kamil Bulat. He's been stabbed in the buttocks.
Kamil was just going about his daily business. He was a builder. He was unloading and loading his van. He didn't see his attacker, couldn't provide us with a description.
Kamil is rushed to hospital, and Cliff and his team now have another vast crime scene to deal with. Extra resources are called in, and the detectives plot a timeline between both the stabbings.
Time parameters within 1 hour and the unusual timing of those offences seem to me that these offences could be linked. This is perhaps where the killer had an attempt, had tried something, and perhaps wasn't satisfied what he had done, and he carried on roaming and looking for his next victim.
The local community is full of fear and worry. All they know at this stage is that somebody is going around carrying out random stabbings to strangers in the public. It could be that this person is experiencing a heightened sense of power and control over the local community. The police are under immense pressure because there could be another attack at any time.
In general terms, if it's a stranger attack, there are more likely to be psychiatric issues. But it's, of course, very difficult to track these people, particularly when there's no relationship between the person and the person they've killed.
Of course, there is a public safety fear. Potentially you've got somebody out there who'd stabbed one individual and then gone on to stab another individual and was still at large.
The various route options between both crime scenes cover more than a square mile.
The difficulty with the crime scene parameters is that you have scene 1, stabbing of Kamil, which is a public space, a road, so we have to secure that. The park where Daniel fell is another crime scene. It's the route between those two scenes. That would be in a natural route that the suspect or suspects would have taken. I would consider that a crime scene as well. And when we interpret the amount of time it took from get to scene 1 to scene 2, it doesn't take an hour to walk that route. Perhaps the killer waited in places for people until he selected his next victim. So when you're looking at a very large physical search and a very large CCTV harvest, you could take various different routes, is the other issue. You could also take public transport. You could drive, you could cycle, or you could walk. And that was hundreds of thousands of hours of CCTV. The second part of that strategy was viewing it. There was no point realistically in viewing it at that stage because you didn't know what you were looking for. And we also didn't know what the suspect looked like. And also, neither entrance to the park or exit to the park is covered by a CCTV camera, only the periphery. It is possible to go to and from the park and not be detected at all. But there was a priority because we knew the route that Daniel Young had taken to the park, and that was important because we wanted to establish the time he had arrived at the park. We'd be able to narrow down more the time of his stabbing and the likely route that the suspect took. And by doing that, he was picked up, Daniel Young, at 7:57 a.m. on a CCTV camera going towards the park.
DCI Lyons plots a timeline using the CCTV digital timestamp of when Daniel is last seen alive.
The call came in to the police. His body had been found at 8:07. That gives us a 10-minute parameter. We're able to narrow that down even further because I had the officers walk from where we picked Daniel up on the CCTV camera into the park to where he fell. So we now had a 2 to 3 minute window of when Daniel was likely stabbed. We weren't able to pick up a suspect or anybody whatsoever who'd followed Daniel into the park, which indicated perhaps that his killer was already in the park or had got to the park through a route that was not covered by the CCTV camera, which is also possible.
The results from the swabs taken from Daniel's clothing and hands are back, and there are no foreign DNA profiles.
It was such a rapid attack. There was absolutely no trace evidence of his attacker at all on the body of Daniel Young.
The lack of trace evidence in CCTV puts a huge emphasis on the search team to locate the murder weapon.
We had officers working double shifts in order to search through here. We had 2 search teams because of the enormity of the task.
It's really important to locate this knife. Finding a knife that potentially might be linked to a murder and attempt murder of 2 individuals is crucial in the investigation. There's potentially fingerprints. And also, on the handle, you may well be able to find the offender's DNA. The decision will be made as to what level of detail are we going to recover items too? Are we going to recover all cigarette ends or drink bottles or footwear marks to try and put somebody in that park?
And the other challenge as well was that in some of those streets and those areas, there was a refuse collection that day, which meant that the bins would be collected, and it is possible and has happened in the past that suspects have deposited weapons in bins and they've ended up in a landfill site. So that became more of a priority to search the bins.
The detectives have very little to work with, but they finally get a much-needed lead.
There was some eyewitnesses who described an individual loitering in the park, and one particular witness said that they got a bad vibe off an individual, a sixth sense if you like, and they gave them a wide berth. But those descriptions were so wide and varied, I couldn't attribute that to any particular individual. It didn't help us in piece together a build or a height or manner of clothing of an individual who may be responsible. But what it did establish, perhaps it was a likely scenario that someone had been in the park and was waiting, and perhaps waiting for a victim.
Despite the discrepancies in the eyewitness accounts, one common denominator is the location this male was seen.
It's a possibility that our attacker could have been waiting on one of those park benches. And it's also those park benches where we secured quite a number of cigarette butts. Those cigarette butts were submitted for analysis.
Cigarette ends are a really good source of DNA because they're placed in somebody's mouth. It's the buccal cells that are in the saliva and also cells from the lips that are retained on the end of the cigarette end. If the cigarette's been smoked by somebody who's on the DNA database, then a profile from the cigarette end will be loaded and that would come up with a hit and come up with a potential name. A name would give the police a lead, some intelligence, and then someone would be arrested or questioned as to have they been in the park, potentially are they linked to the murder of Mr. Young.
And from that we identified some people that those cigarette butts belonged to. Through extensive inquiries, we were able to eliminate them from the inquiry that they were innocently in the park at different times and had nothing to do with Daniel Young's murder. We were in a situation where no one saw what had happened, either to Daniel Young or to Camille. But we were really, if you like, clutching at straws. We didn't know who this killer was, and we were fearful that this killer was at large and may well go on to cause further harm and injury to the people of London.
For Daniel's younger brother Tom, the situation becomes increasingly difficult to comprehend.
We still couldn't piece together what had happened. Couldn't move past the fact that we couldn't pick up the phone and speak to him, and we were still in that early stage of shock. Dan, in a nutshell, he was just the best big brother I could have asked for, really. Nothing was ever too much for him. He was always putting people first, helping everyone. Across sort of all his friends and people he's worked with, even though he was in London or all over the world, you could always message him, ring him, wherever, and he'd always try and help in some way, shape or form. He loved to travel and those experiences. As he was coming up to his 30th, he's done a lot in such a short amount of time, so he was realising actually I need to settle down and look at what career he can have for a long time. He was really into his education, studying, and when he announced he had the job as a lecturer, I think we were all really excited to see where that was going to go. We could see what it meant to him as well. He was so happy and so excited to help others and provide all that education for people to sort of follow his path as well. He was really keen to pass that on. And when we found out how he had actually died, our minds were just racing and we were worried that there might have been more people that morning that had been harmed and maybe hadn't gone to seek treatment or could have been sort of dead somewhere and people don't know where they are.
As the forensics continue to comb through both crime scenes, another 999 call comes in.
A phone call had been received to the police. An individual had claimed that there'd been a stabbing in a location nearby. Police responded to that. We've now had 3 stabbings within a very short period of time, within a very small geographical area.
That definitely ramps up the investigation to another level because effectively there might be a serial killer out on the loose with maybe more bodies that have yet to be discovered. "30-year-old university lecturer Daniel Young
has been murdered whilst on his way to work. His killer is still on the loose. A 23-year-old male has also been stabbed less than a mile away and is in a critical condition. Detectives believe the stabbings are linked, and a specialist team continues to search for the murder weapon. DCI Cliff Lyons is alerted to a 999 call claiming that the attacker has struck again.
We investigated that case, and from looking at CCTV, deploying a large amount of resources to that incident and speaking to witnesses, it was clear there was no stabbing, there was no victim.
Police tracked down the hoax caller using digital cell site analysis.
We visited that individual, and it turned out that that person used the park where Daniel fell to practice his martial art, kata, every day. He was disgruntled that we had shut down the park for our forensic and physical search strategy, and that's why he made the phone call. In essence, it was a hoax call because he was disgruntled.
Once we found out then it was someone sort of making a hoax call and that they were frustrated and that the park was shut, there was a huge element of anger there, that to be so insensitive and make that call from our side of it was offensive.
When you get someone who callously considers this death not that important and it's more important they use the park, then I'm only human. Emotionally it upsets me. But you deal with that, you just compartmentalise that side of it.
The man was arrested, his house was searched, and he was interrogated at length by detectives, before eventually being released without charge. At the crime scene, the teams have been extensively fingertip searching the area and have made a discovery.
The search team found a knife with a 10cm blade. This was buried, barely visible, in undergrowth at the edge of the park, approximately 90 metres from where Daniel fell. It wasn't immediately visible that the knife had blood on it because it wasn't a blood-stained knife. Blood can be microscopic, and when blood dries it looks and does have the appearance of rust. But there's something you can do at a crime scene, it's called a presumptive test, which you can test for the presence of blood.
One of the tests that most police forces use is called a Castle-Meyer test. It uses several different chemicals. It uses hydrogen peroxide, ethanol, and a chemical called Castle-Meyer, which is a phenolphthalein-based chemical. And it effectively works on the hemoglobin of the blood, so the iron part of the blood is detectable. A small swab is taken from an area on a small bit of filter paper. Hydrogen peroxide is added to that small area, and then KM is dripped onto the same area. If it's positive for blood, that turns bright pink in colour.
And that particular knife did test positively for blood. That knife was examined urgently by the laboratory, and it was with the scientists within 1.5 hours of the discovery.
We were told almost straight away that they had found a knife in the park. The liaison officer said it was quite difficult to find because it was quite a thick bit of hedge that it was in. Found out there wasn't much on it, so they have to send it off to do certain DNA testing and use quite cutting edge technology because of such a minimal sample that was on there. So we didn't get ahead of ourselves and didn't start thinking that's it, they're going to find someone.
Is this knife a relevant and significant find, or is the knife completely not related to the stabbing? People do carry knives. This knife found in the parkland could be just a discarded knife from a completely separate offence and have nothing to do with the murder of our victim. There's several ways that we could examine this knife. There may well still be blood on the hilt of the knife where the handle meets the blade. There may be traces of blood on the handle, and also there may be traces of blood on the blade itself and on the tip of the knife. Everyone's DNA is quite similar, but there's certain areas of DNA that are slightly different within individuals, and it's those areas that are targeted within the DNA profiling, and it's those areas that we're able to prove that that DNA is unique to that individual. The statistics on getting a DNA profile could be up to 1 in a billion. I mean, 1 in a billion is like, it's got to be you.
We'd taken a DNA sample from Daniel, and we'd also taken a DNA sample from Camille. And we asked the laboratory to look at that control sample at the same time as Daniel's to establish whether his blood was on the knife or not. And it came back that Camille's DNA was present on the knife. And it also confirmed that this blood was the blood of Daniel Young. So we had our murder weapon. which was quite remarkable. It would have meant that the killer had used that same knife, transported it all that journey, stabbed Daniel Young with it, discarded it 90 metres at the crime scene, and it still had the DNA of Camille on it, and it still had the DNA of Daniel on it. So now we had what definitively had linked those two crimes. The laboratory reported that there was still mixed profile DNA on there. Any other DNA on the knife that is not Camille's or Daniel's, which we refer to as alien DNA. I was able to search in the DNA database, and because of that profile search, we found a name, Mark Loveridge. It was confirmed that his DNA was on the knife. Mark Loveridge was a dangerous individual with a previous offending history. He was under the care of the mental health NHS services and had been discharged, and he was free to roam the community. He was a sick individual with violent tendencies. We needed to find him and capture him quickly. If we didn't find him and he was aware that we were looking for him, my fear was he would continue to offend and we wouldn't find him, he would go to ground.
Loveridge had a history of mental diagnoses and violence, including convictions dating back to 1994 for attacking strangers with knives and iron bars. When he was aged 21, Loveridge was referred to psychiatric services, and he told doctors that he was struggling to not act on the voices in his head. Loveridge was known to be a prolific user of cannabis, cocaine, and amphetamines. Prolonged drug use exacerbates existing mental health conditions. It can trigger paranoid beliefs in vulnerable individuals, and together they can worsen over time.
He wasn't at any old haunts, and it was interesting when we spoke to his friends, his colleagues, that everybody feared him. We got testimony from people he'd worked with. He threatened them with violence of knives before. Even his own family feared him, and they'd battled for years to get him mental health treatment.
Someone like him with complex problems which relate to his personality, his history of psychiatric illness, his history of drug abuse, his criminal history, make him a dangerous individual. The police need to track him down before he carried out any further offences.
Multiple units swarm the area around Mark Loveridge's home address.
We saw Mark Loveridge walking his dog nearby to his house. 3 of my officers were in plain clothes. When the first officer introduced himself, he hadn't even got his warrant card out, when Mark Loveridge just simply tied up his dog to a lamppost and attacked the officer with flaying fists. He missed. Another officer standing behind rugby tackled Mark Loveridge to the ground. He was handcuffed, and that was the end of the fight. Mark Loveridge did not get the violent confrontation that he wanted with the police officers, and he was taken to Lewisham Police Station. In custody, as soon as any of the detectives in this case went anywhere near Mark Loveridge, they were met with extreme aggression and resentment. It was clear that Mark Loveridge resented the fact that the detectives had found out who he was and what he had done.
Initially we were told the name Mark Loveridge, obviously the name to us meant nothing. When it transpired that he was under the care of a mental health service at the time, for us that just added a whole different dimension to it of, well, how significant are his mental health concerns. But I still think at the time we weren't in a position to process that fully. We were more, as anyone would be, grieving Dan, and we weren't able to comprehend that someone like Mark Loveridge, with what he was experiencing, was freely out and about.
The interview process was hampered because as soon as my detectives got anywhere near him while he was in his cell, he would barricade the cell, ask for a violent confrontation, and when we did actually get in the cell, he'd then urinate towards us and make threats. So Mark Loveridge was very difficult to deal with, but eventually we did interview him. He maintained from a very early stage that he was innocent, and that we, the police, in particular the detectives in this case, had fitted him up, in his words, and framed him.
Despite the compelling forensic evidence on the knife, Cliff and his team need more. The digital forensic team have collated some key information whilst analysing Loveridge's mobile phone.
We were able to use telephone data to place Mark Loveridge in the area of the murder. The mistake that Mark Loveridge had made is that when he involved in his stabbing, he text messaged his employer and told them that he'll be late that day.
It was recorded that there was a text message that he'd sent shortly before the stabbing of Daniel Young, in which he said he was going to be late for work. which implies a degree of premeditation.
The fact that he took the time to report that he was going to be late for work indicates his engagement with reality before the attack.
He was careful and cunning to commit this crime when nobody was looking. And when he made good his escape, walked away, so no one noticed him walking away. He didn't run away. No one saw a man running, ever. Mark Loveridge simply walked away, having felled Daniel Young in that sudden and violent attack. It soon became apparent that Mark Loveridge was to confess that this was not a fit-up, this was not a frame-up, that he had stabbed both Camille and that he had stabbed Daniel. But he was later suggest by his defence team was an automatic response that he had made, as in he had struck out his arm, which had a knife in it, into the abdomen of Daniel, and that had caused him to die. But he hadn't meant to do that. Anyone coming near him, he just lashed out. The evidence really against Mark Loveridge was the powerful evidence of the presence of his DNA on the murder weapon that also had the presence of Daniel Young, Camille, on the knife. The fact that he made a text message near the park to his employer and said he would be late. The fact that his address was quite near to the first stabbing. The fact that his address was a natural route from the first stabbing to the second stabbing. The fact that he had a propensity to violence, had previous offending history, had previously stabbed people. But a very telling bit of evidence is that we've got information that he had told a person not long before he had killed Daniel Young and stabbed Camille that he wanted to stab someone. All of that combined, the circumstantial evidence and the hard physical evidence, the forensic evidence, we had, in my view, a very strong case against Mark Loveridge.
The CPS agree that Mark Loveridge can be charged for the murder of Daniel Young and the stabbing of Camille Bullat, who has been discharged from the hospital. The prosecution need to decide whether Loveridge's mental health issues warrant a case for diminished responsibility, as raised by his defence team. Mark Loveridge has admitted to killing university lecturer Daniel Young and stabbing builder Camille Bullat. His defence team have presented a case of diminished responsibility. The Crown Prosecution Service must determine whether they agree or not.
In the usual course, the defence will always instruct their own expert who reports independently and reports first to confirm whether he's suffering from an abnormality of the mind, so to speak. And his psychiatrist confirmed that he was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia, and therefore Mark Loveridge had the partial defence of diminished responsibility available to him. Subsequent to that report, Dr. Philip Joseph then prepared a report on behalf of the Crown Prosecution Service.
What I have to do is undertake a comprehensive psychiatric assessment. I go through his upbringing, his history of any psychiatric illness, his history of drug abuse, criminal history. I found him quite guarded, a degree of hostility. There was a potential for aggression. He didn't really show remorse in the sense of expressing sorrow for the killing or upset about the victim of the offence. As well as talking to him in some detail, it's necessary to apply the wording of the Homicide Act to see if he fits the criteria for diminished responsibility. He himself recognised that his mental state was deteriorating in the period leading up to the killing. He'd stopped his antipsychotic medication, despite being encouraged in a letter to continue taking it, even though previously, some years before, he had apparently sought psychiatric help because he was worried that he might stab somebody. So it is likely that he had started to experiencing psychotic symptoms. Basically, hearing a voice telling him to stab somebody.
Loveridge claimed the voices in his head said get ready, and they told him that the first person he saw, who walked past him from a certain direction, was the man that he should stab. Voices in the head can be referred to as auditory hallucinations and can be a feature of schizophrenia and other mental health conditions. These voices can be threatening, persuasive, persistent, and involve giving orders to harm oneself or others.
Now, in paranoid schizophrenia, it's not uncommon for individuals to experience single or multiple auditory hallucinations, and he is telling me that his arm instinctively went out and stabbed somebody. It's suggesting his mind not fully controlling his actions. There was a text message in which he said he was going to be late for work, which implies a degree of premeditation. Also, he went off to work that day, may well have been appearing apparently quite normal. He carried on living his life for a number of days before he was arrested. So it suggests that despite suffering from psychotic symptoms, he was able to conceal them and appear relatively normal to others. And that is something that people with suffering from paranoid schizophrenia can do. Overall, it was probable that he was suffering from a significant psychiatric condition at the time. So having agreed that the mental responsibility was diminished, a decision had to be made about how to deal with him through the courts.
The judge will consider the current offence before them, the previous offending history, the danger that that offender poses to the public. It's a combination of factors, but they have to consider this very carefully when sentencing the offender.
The court accepts Loveridge's guilty pleas on grounds of diminished responsibility for the murder of Daniel Young and grievous bodily harm for attacking Camille Balat. The judge stated that Loveridge was a dangerous man who posed a high risk to the public in the future. He sentenced him to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 15 years to be served in Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital until he is deemed suitable for prison.
Once he was leaving, I can still see it as clear as day as he was walking down the steps, and we locked eyes for, it was probably only a second, but it felt like an hour. It was unnerving. It was quite a surreal moment to actually look at him and to think that he was probably the last person that Dan ever saw.
Loveridge is no longer a threat to the public, much to the relief of Daniel's family, but there are many questions that remain unanswered.
We started to look more at the NHS side of it, and it isn't as simple as Mark was discharged and he was off his medication. There's a lot of emphasis on him to self-medicate. We felt that he had been failed just as much as Dan, and why is no one looking at this NHS treatment and care in the right way?
Julian Hendy lost his father in similar circumstances and set up a charity to help grieving families like Daniel's to get answers and accountability.
There are around 100 to 120 mental health related homicides in England and the UK each year, and a lot of the mental health related cases are people who are generally known to services, and the services have an opportunity to intervene and do something to possibly prevent what's happening. I think most families want an apology for what's happened, and they want some accountability, that people actually put their hands up and say, the quality of care we delivered in this case wasn't up to standard, and we will make sure that as far as possible this can't happen again. And I find there have been repeated failures in the care of Mark Loveridge. I think they hadn't maintained the risk properly, they didn't make sure he took his medication, they discharged him too early, with the result that he was dangerous and at liberty and unwell on the day he killed Dan Young.
With Julian's assistance, Daniel's family have persevered for accountability. 5 years after Daniel was murdered, an NHS assurance review was finally published. It confirmed that risk management was insufficiently carried out regarding Mark Loveridge, despite him volunteering himself for help on a number of occasions. The report also acknowledged that Loveridge was advised by a letter to continue taking his antipsychotic medication, something he ignored.
There is a part of me that feels sorry for him and feels that he was let down by the system. People who are experiencing severe and significant mental health concerns such as Loveridge should be given the time, the resources and that investment that they need, not to be discharged and told on a discharge letter that there's a significant chance of relapse. Clinicians in A&E not being fully aware of him and his background. So there is a part of me that does feel that he's been let down.
The report stated that clinical staff did not prioritise risk management that accounted for Loveridge's history of high-risk behaviour, and that they vow to implement changes based on their findings.
Someone like him with complex problems which relate to his personality and his abuse of drugs and his mental illness requires labour-intensive psychiatric follow-up in the community, which is very hard to provide because of the depletion of resources and the number of psychiatric patients who do require that degree of follow-up. And there may well be issues about competence of particular mental health staff. There needs to be proper training, there needs to be proper assessment, appraisal, support of staff, being able to talk to other members of staff in more senior positions when they've got worries and difficulties with a particular patient.
Daniel's family and Julian are determined that new protocols and measures are put in place to help prevent scenarios like this in the future.
We have the same number of psychiatric beds in England now as we had in about 1860. And we've got 4 times the population and probably sicker people now. I think these things will continue. We do need to make sure that there's a cultural change about dealing with violence. Some more funding, I'm sure, would go a long way, would help. But, we need to start funding the prevention and not just picking up the bill at the aftermath.
Being so invested in this and asking these questions really helps me to feel quite connected to Dan. And if I can help people not go through a similar experience, that's kind of enough for me. I know that we'll never fix it and it will never be a problem that just disappears. It would always be there and arguably possibly get worse with time as well. But I think now is a good opportunity to invest in it and to make sure we're asking those questions. It's definitely challenging having that conflict of emotion towards Loveridge at times, because there are days where I resent him, but I feel to this day that had things been done differently with his treatment, it would have been prevented. It's
humbling that Daniel's family recognise the issues with Mark Loveridge, and that's great credit to them. It is the case, in my opinion, I agree with them, that Mark Loveridge did have diminished responsibility. Mark Loveridge was in need of help. It doesn't make it any easier for them to understand why their loved one, Daniel, will be killed. It may or may not be of some comfort to them. It was nothing about Daniel in particular that resulted in his death. It was a random stranger attack by a person with mental health difficulties.